Michael Jordan discovers his childhood PE teacher is struggling. His next move changes everything. Michael Jordan sat in his office, a calm silence surrounding him as he sifted through the endless paperwork and meetings that had become part of his post-basketball life. But the phone call he had received earlier that morning kept lingering in his mind. It wasn't about business, sponsorships, or any of the usual distractions of his high-profile life. This call was personal, and it had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. The voice on the other end of the line had been familiar, but also filled with a kind of desperation that Michael wasn't used to hearing. It was the voice of his childhood PE teacher, Mr. Thomas Waters. A man who, for years, had been more than just a teacher to Michael. Mr. Waters had been a mentor, a guiding force during Michael's formative years. He had always pushed Michael to be his best, both in sports and in life. But now, hearing the tone in his voice, Michael knew something was terribly wrong. "Mike," Mr. Waters had said, his voice rough with emotion, "I didn't know who else to turn to. Things have been tough lately. I never thought I'd be in this position. I'm struggling, Mike. I need help." Michael's hand had frozen on the phone. Struggling? Mr. Waters? The man who had been a solid, steady presence in his life, who had always seemed invincible in Michael's eyes, was now asking for help. The thought was almost incomprehensible. Michael remembered all too well how Mr. Waters had helped him when he was just a young boy with big dreams, always offering encouragement, always believing in him when others doubted. Mr. Waters had been there for Michael when the other kids hadn't thought he had what it took to play basketball. He had been the one to cheer him on during those early years in high school, when Michael was still trying to find his way. And now, years later, it was Michael's turn to step up. As Michael listened to Mr. Waters explain his situation, a mix of financial trouble, personal loss, and mounting health issues, his mind began to race. How could this happen to someone who had given so much to others? Someone who had helped shape him into the person he had become? When the call ended, Michael sat in silence for a long moment, staring out the window of his office. He thought about the countless times he had been in Mr. Waters' classroom, running drills on the basketball court or listening to his coach's encouraging words. The lessons he had learned from the man were countless. Not just about sports, but about life itself. Discipline. Hard work. Never giving up. Mr. Waters had been his guide, his rock. But now, it seemed, that same rock had been cracked. Michael's chest tightened as he thought about the struggles his old teacher had faced. Mr. Waters hadn't just been his PE teacher, he had been a father figure, a man who had made him believe in himself when no one else did. And now, he needed Michael's help. Without thinking twice, Michael reached for his phone again, this time dialing his personal assistant. "I need you to get in touch with my financial advisor. I need to find out what we can do for Mr. Waters. He's in trouble, and I need to help him." His voice was firm, determined. The same determination that had driven him to greatness on the basketball court now fueled his desire to help the man who had helped shape him. Michael knew that helping his old PE teacher wasn't going to be as simple as writing a check. No, this was about something deeper. Something more personal. And he couldn't let his teacher, someone who had given so much, struggle in silence. As he waited for the call to be returned, Michael's mind drifted back to the days when he was a young boy, just starting to grow into the athlete he would one day become. Back then, he had always looked up to Mr. Waters, but now, in this moment, it was time for Michael to stand tall for him. The phone rang. Michael answered without hesitation. "Get everything together," he instructed. "I'm going to visit him. We're going to figure this out together." Michael wasn't sure what exactly he would be able to do, but one thing was clear, he wasn't going to let Mr. Waters face his struggles alone. After all, Mr. Waters had been there for him when no one else believed he could make it. Now it was Michael's turn to give back, and he was going to do whatever it took to make sure his childhood mentor wouldn't fall through the cracks. As Michael Jordan's private jet touched down in his hometown of Wilmington, North Carolina, he felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him. It had been years since he'd been back to this small town, the place where his journey had begun. A place where the dreams of a young boy with big aspirations had taken root, a place where he had learned some of life's most important lessons. It was where he had first met Mr. Thomas Waters. The drive from the airport to the old neighborhood felt surreal. The streets hadn't changed much, but Michael could feel the nostalgia pressing in from every direction. He passed by the school where he had played his first basketball game, the park where he had spent hours practicing his shots after school, and the old gym where Mr. Waters had first seen the potential in him. All of it had played a part in shaping him into the man he had become. But it wasn't just the memories of his early career that filled his mind, it was the man who had made those memories possible, Mr. Waters. The teacher who had always seen something in him when others didn't. The man who had always pushed him to work harder, to believe in himself when self-doubt crept in. Mr. Waters had been the steady hand guiding him through the early years of his life, and now Michael found himself in the position to return that favor. As the car pulled up to Mr. Waters' house, Michael took a deep breath. The house was modest, nestled in a quiet neighborhood that had clearly seen better days. The lawn wasn't as well kept as it used to be, and there were signs of wear and tear on the exterior. Michael could sense the struggles that had taken their toll on his former teacher. He got out of the car and walked up the front steps, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knocked on the door, his heart beating a little faster than usual. He wasn't sure what kind of reception he would get. After all, he hadn't seen Mr. Waters in years, and he wasn't sure how his teacher would react to his sudden appearance. But as the door opened, all of Michael's doubts disappeared. There stood Mr. Waters, slightly older, a little thinner than Michael remembered, but still unmistakably the man who had been there for him all those years ago. His eyes widened when he saw Michael standing on his doorstep, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The years seemed to collapse in on themselves as they stood there, the weight of their shared history settling between them. "Mike?" Mr. Waters said, his voice cracking slightly. I never thought I'd see you again." Michael smiled warmly, stepping forward and extending his hand. "It's been a while, hasn't it?" he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "But I couldn't stay away. I heard what's been going on, and I wanted to make sure you're okay." Mr. Waters hesitated, looking down at his feet for a moment. His expression softened, but there was a visible strain in his eyes. The pride that had once been so evident in his face now seemed weighed down by life's difficulties. "I didn't want to bother you with my problems, Mike. You've got your own life, your own career. You've done more than enough for me." Michael shook his head, refusing to let his teacher dismiss him so easily. "Mr. Waters, you were there for me when no one else was. When I thought I couldn't make the team, when I wasn't good enough, you were the one who told me to keep going. You taught me how to work hard, how to believe in myself. If there's anyone I'm going to help, it's you." For a moment, Mr. Waters didn't say anything. He simply stared at Michael, as if trying to process the enormity of what he was hearing. Finally, he stepped aside, allowing Michael to enter the house. "Come in," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. As Michael stepped inside, he took in the modest furnishings of the house. There were pictures on the walls, some of Mr. Waters with his family, others of his younger years as a coach. The house had a warmth to it, but there was also an unmistakable sense of wear. Michael could see how hard his former teacher had worked to maintain everything, even as life had thrown him curveballs. They sat down at the small kitchen table, and Mr. Waters finally spoke, his voice filled with a mix of pride and regret. "I always knew you had something special, Mike. You were different from the other kids. You just needed someone to believe in you." He paused, looking down at his hands. "But I never imagined I'd be the one who needed help." Michael could feel the weight of those words, and it hit him harder than he expected. This wasn't just about a man who had taught him basketball, it was about someone who had believed in him when the world hadn't. And now, that same person was struggling. It wasn't right. Michael knew he had to do something. "You were always there for me, Mr. Waters," Michael said, his voice steady. "And now I'm here for you." Whatever you need, I'm going to make sure you get it. Mr. Waters looked up at him, his eyes filled with emotion. I never expected anything like this from you, Mike. You've made it so far, and yet you still remember me. I'm grateful. I just don't know what I've done to deserve this. Michael smiled, reaching across the table and placing a hand on Mr. Waters' shoulder. You don't have to deserve it, sir. You've already given me more than enough. Now, it's my turn. The conversation turned to the specifics of what Mr. Waters was going through, the financial struggles, the mounting medical bills, and the growing isolation as he faced each day. But as Michael listened, he knew he couldn't simply offer sympathy, he had to take action. He stood up, determined. We'll figure this out. You're not alone in this. And I'm not leaving until we come up with a plan. The conversation that followed was a humbling one for both men. Michael sat back in his chair as Mr. Waters spoke, his voice quivering slightly as he detailed the depth of his struggles. There was no bravado left in him. The man who had once stood as an unshakable figure in Michael's life was now worn down, the weight of personal and financial burdens too much to bear on his own. After I left teaching, Mike, I had a hard time finding anything stable, Mr. Waters said, rubbing his hands together nervously. The school closed down, and the opportunities for teachers like me, well, they're few and far between. I've been working odd jobs, but it's never enough to keep up with the bills. Michael watched him, his heart sinking as the full extent of his teacher's situation became clear. Mr. Waters had been a role model, an inspiration. To think of him, the man who had supported countless students, now struggling just to keep food on the table, was almost too much to bear. It's not just the money, though, Mr. Waters continued, his voice tinged with regret. I've been dealing with some health issues, Mike. Diabetes, high blood pressure. I'm doing my best to stay on top of it, but when you don't have the resources, it becomes overwhelming. I try to keep it to myself, but sometimes it feels like I'm fighting a battle I can't win. Michael leaned forward, listening intently. It was hard to hear, but he needed to understand the full picture. He needed to know exactly how dire the situation had become. I never wanted to ask you for anything, Mike, Mr. Waters added, his gaze falling to the floor. You've done so much already. I know you've got your own life, your own career. I didn't want to burden you with my problems. Michael shook his head, the determination in his eyes unwavering. Mr. Waters, don't even think like that. You've been there for me when no one else was. It's my turn to help you now. But there was more, much more. Mr. Waters continued to reveal the extent of his financial struggles, explaining how bills had piled up, how debts were left unpaid, and how the medical expenses had drained his savings. What had once been a man full of energy and optimism had been reduced to someone barely scraping by, weighed down by circumstances beyond his control. Michael could feel the overwhelming urge to do something. He had the resources, the means, the influence. He wasn't just a retired athlete. He was a businessman, a philanthropist, someone who had the power to make a difference. But as he listened to Mr. Waters, Michael realized that this wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about respect, about giving back in a way that truly mattered. There has to be more we can do than just write a check, Michael said, his voice quiet but resolute. I want to make sure you're set up, Mr. Waters. I want to help you get back on your feet, not just now, but long term. Mr. Waters looked up at him, eyes wide with disbelief. Mike, I don't even know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Michael replied, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. You've done enough for me. You believed in me when no one else did. I'm going to make sure you don't have to struggle anymore. Michael stood up and walked toward the window, looking out over the small neighborhood. His mind was already racing with plans. He would reach out to some of his connections, get in touch with local organizations, see how he could set up a foundation, get medical support from Mr. Waters, and make sure he had the financial stability to rebuild his life. But there was still something deeper, something more emotional, that Michael knew he had to address. He couldn't simply throw money at the situation and expect everything to fix itself. He had to show Mr. Waters that he mattered, that his impact on Michael's life was something that would never be forgotten. "Mr. Waters," Michael said, turning back toward the older man, "you helped me become who I am. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for you. Now, I'm going to make sure you know how much you've meant to me." Mr. Waters nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "Mike, you don't know how much that means to me. All these years, I've just been doing my best, you know? Trying to make a difference. But hearing you say that, it's more than I ever could have hoped for." Michael smiled, his resolve only growing stronger. "You don't need to do it alone anymore. We'll get through this together." The conversation shifted from the grim reality of the situation to a more hopeful tone as Michael began making plans. He promised to help Mr. Waters with immediate financial relief, but he also talked about longer-term solutions, helping him find a steady job, making sure his health care was taken care of, and ultimately getting him back to the point where he could enjoy the life he deserved. As the sun began to set over the quiet neighborhood, Michael felt a sense of clarity. This was the kind of change that mattered. This was the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind, not just through basketball, but through actions that made a real, lasting impact on the people who had shaped his journey. The days following his visit to Mr. Waters were filled with phone calls, meetings, and the beginning of action. Michael Jordan wasn't one to sit idly by when something needed to be done, and this time was no different. He had already made up his mind that he would help Mr. Waters, but now, it was about figuring out exactly how to make the most impact. It wasn't just about writing a check or sending money, it was about creating something sustainable, something that would honor Mr. Waters and the countless students he had influenced over the years. Michael knew that simply offering financial help wouldn't address the root of the problem. He needed to find a way to help Mr. Waters rebuild his life on his own terms. First, Michael contacted his network of business associates and philanthropists to see how he could help with the immediate financial strain. Bills were piling up, and Mr. Waters was struggling to cover basic expenses. Michael was determined to take that burden off of his teacher's shoulders. But money, as Michael knew all too well, was just one piece of the puzzle. Next, he contacted a few former coaches and mentors who had known Mr. Waters from the old days. He wanted to know how they could come together to offer Mr. Waters not just financial help, but also career opportunities. Maybe he could return to coaching in some capacity, or perhaps take on a position that would allow him to continue contributing to the community, just in a different way. Michael knew Mr. Waters had so much more to give. But beyond the logistics of it all, Michael had a deeper, more personal goal in mind. He wanted to give Mr. Waters a sense of purpose again, to make sure that he knew his value extended far beyond what his paycheck said. He had been the one to help Michael find his way, now it was time to do the same for him. One evening, as Michael sat in his home office, reviewing potential ways to invest in Mr. Waters' future, he received a text message from his assistant. "I've arranged the meeting for tomorrow morning with the healthcare team. We're also looking at potential job opportunities. You should be proud of how much people want to help him." Michael smiled to himself. This was what it was all about, the power of community, of giving back. He felt proud, not just for being able to help, but for the fact that his influence could bring so many people together for a good cause. It felt like a chance to make a real difference, not just for one person, but for everyone connected to him. The next day, Michael drove back to Mr. Waters' house, this time with more than just a plan. He had the means to put it into action. When he arrived, Mr. Waters greeted him with a weary smile, but Michael could see the relief in his eyes. It was as if a heavy burden had already started to lift. "I've been talking to a few people," Michael said as they sat down at the kitchen table again. "We've got the medical bills covered for the time being. And we've also found some options for you to get back into coaching. There are some high school programs looking for mentors, and I think you'd be perfect for them." Mr. Waters' eyes widened as he absorbed the news. It was almost as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Mike, I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever could have imagined. I thought I'd lost everything. I never thought anyone would come back and help me." Michael reached across the table, placing a hand on Mr. Waters' arm. You don't have to thank me, sir. You've always been there for me. Now it's my turn to make sure you're taken care of. I want to make sure that you can live the rest of your life without struggling. You deserve that." The relief in Mr. Waters' expression was overwhelming. The tears that had started to well up in his eyes were no longer tears of despair, they were tears of gratitude, of hope. "I can't tell you how much this means to me, Mike. I spent so many years just trying to get by, never thinking that anyone would come back for me. And now, it feels like there's a chance to start over." Michael nodded, a quiet smile on his face. "We're going to get you back on your feet, Mr. Waters. You're not alone in this anymore." For the next few hours, they continued to talk about the possibilities ahead. The healthcare plans, the coaching opportunities, and even some potential speaking engagements that could use Mr. Waters' experience and wisdom. Michael was determined to ensure that his teacher had not just the resources to survive, but the chance to thrive once again. By the time Michael left, he knew that this was just the beginning. The help he had provided was substantial, but it was also just a stepping stone toward something more profound. He had given Mr. Waters a lifeline, but it was up to him to take it. Michael knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. As he drove away, Michael couldn't help but reflect on the lesson he had learned. In all his years of success, he had been surrounded by people who had helped him along the way. Now, it was his turn to pass that support forward. He wasn't just making a difference in Mr. Waters' life, he was creating a ripple effect, one that would spread to others in need and inspire a community to rally behind those who had given so much. The days and weeks that followed Michael Jordan's intervention marked a transformative period not only for Mr. Waters but also for the entire community. Word of Michael's generosity spread quickly. It wasn't just the financial assistance that made an impact, but the deeper, more profound change he had sparked. Through his actions, Michael had shown the world that success wasn't only measured in championships and endorsement deals. It was measured by the lives you touched, the people you lifted up, and the opportunities you created for others to rise. In the weeks following their meeting, Mr. Waters had begun to regain his footing. The medical bills that had once been a source of constant worry were now taken care of, thanks to Michael's direct intervention. But it wasn't just the relief from financial stress that had changed Mr. Waters' life. The opportunity to return to coaching, to once again mentor and inspire young athletes, had rekindled a sense of purpose in him that he hadn't felt in years. Michael had connected Mr. Waters with a local high school that had been looking for an experienced mentor to guide their basketball program. The principal had been eager to meet him, and after a few discussions, it was clear that Mr. Waters would be a perfect fit. The young athletes who had been struggling with discipline and focus now had someone to look up to, someone who had seen success in the game, but more importantly, someone who could show them how to overcome adversity both on and off the court. The first day Mr. Waters walked back into a gym to meet the team, it was like the energy in the room shifted. The players, many of whom had been struggling with their own personal challenges, stood a little taller. They listened more intently. And when Mr. Waters spoke, it wasn't just about the game, it was about life. It was about hard work, resilience, and the belief that anyone could overcome the obstacles that life put in their way. "I know what it's like to feel like you're at the bottom," Mr. Waters told the team one day during practice, his voice filled with emotion. "But you have to remember, it's not about how many times you fall, it's about how many times you get up." It was a simple statement, but it resonated deeply with the players. They could feel the authenticity in Mr. Waters' words. He wasn't just a coach trying to teach them how to win, he was someone who understood what it meant to fight through difficult circumstances and come out stronger on the other side. Meanwhile, Michael continued to stay in touch with Mr. Waters, checking in regularly to ensure everything was going smoothly. He was pleased to see his old teacher not only regain his confidence but begin to flourish in this new chapter of his life. Michael knew that this kind of change couldn't be measured in just dollars and cents. It was about empowering someone to take control of their own future. One day, as Michael was sitting in his office, his phone rang. It was Mr. Waters. His voice, once filled with uncertainty, was now strong and vibrant. "Mike, I just wanted to thank you again," Mr. Waters said, the gratitude evident in his tone. I'm doing better than I've been in years. I'm back coaching, I'm feeling healthier, and I've even started speaking at a few events about my experiences. I don't know what to say, you've given me a second chance." Michael smiled to himself, leaning back in his chair. "You don't have to thank me. You earned it. I'm just happy to help." But there was more to it than that. Michael knew that the ripple effect of his actions was only just beginning. By helping Mr. Waters, he had set in motion a series of events that would inspire others to give back, to help those who had given so much in the past. People were watching. They were taking note of the way Michael had used his platform and resources to lift up someone who had once been a guiding light in his life. The local community began to take notice, too. Inspired by Michael's actions, other former students of Mr. Waters started reaching out to offer help. Some offered financial support, others volunteered their time to assist with the new coaching programs, and a few even stepped forward to provide mentorship to younger athletes in need of guidance. It wasn't just one person's struggle anymore, it had become a community-wide effort to support someone who had supported them. As Mr. Waters continued to mentor the next generation of athletes, the ripple effect reached further and further. The players he mentored weren't just learning basketball, they were learning about perseverance, about the power of second chances, and about the importance of paying it forward. Many of these young athletes, inspired by Mr. Waters' resilience, began to look for ways to help others, to be the mentors, the guides, that their community needed. Michael, of course, remained a part of this ever-growing web of support, though he did so quietly, away from the public eye. He had no interest in fanfare or recognition for his actions. What mattered to him was that his former teacher, the man who had been there for him when no one else had, was now thriving, and in turn, helping others do the same. Over time, Michael's investment in Mr. Waters began to bear fruit in ways he hadn't anticipated. The school's basketball program flourished, the students excelled both on the court and in life, and Mr. Waters himself became a beloved figure in the community once again. What had started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something far more profound, a legacy of giving, of helping one another, and of changing lives, one person at a time. And in the quiet moments of reflection, Michael knew that this was the real victory. Not the trophies, not the endorsement deals, not even the accolades from his basketball career. The real victory was in the lives he had touched, and the person he had helped to rise again. And it was a victory that would continue long after he had walked away from the game.